Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 21 of Diabetics for Diabetics Radio. My name is Bowie Madison. I am your host. Today, we are talking about something that I have been stewing over, brewing on, getting excited about for the longest time. And it's taken a little bit of time to put pen to paper, to map it out in a way that I feel like gets what's going on in my mind onto the page and into your ears. So here we are. We're talking about epigenetics and the potential heritability of imbalanced systems. So if you're not familiar with what epigenetics is, we will talk about that in the episode. We'll also talk about genetics, of which epigenetics is kind of a branch off of, and all the things that they involve, how they interact and intertwine in humans, in their genes, in their health. So we'll learn how genes aren't the only thing that we're inheriting from our lineage, the way that we think that we are. If we have not met yet, my name is Bowie Madison. I have had type 1 diabetes for 21 years. I am digging into the research, learning about holistic health, nutrition, supplementation, alternative ways of healing to try and heal my diabetes, and sharing information as I go. I'm on TikTok as well. Chances are you're here because of TikTok. I started this about a year ago now. And again, sharing ideas, just kind of like venting different research topics that I was getting interested in the alternative health space as it pertained to type 1 diabetes. And it has since blossomed into this incredible project. And here we are already on episode 21. So if you have type 1 diabetes, if you know someone who does, or type 2 diabetes for that matter, there's a lot more carryover than people care to admit. Go ahead and subscribe, follow along. Here we go. Let's talk about epigenetics. So even if you don't know the term epigenetics yet, chances are you're familiar at least with the general concepts behind genetics, right? When you think of genes, you think of, okay, I'm inheriting something from my mom, something from my dad. The combination of the two are what came together to kind of make me, right? So you've got your family lineage to be mindful of, that family tree on the left. And then on the right, when you think of the outcomes of combining genes, right? This graph or this table here is an example of Mendelian genetics, which is a simplified version of what happens when you combine genes. Basically, when you take a gene from your mom and a gene from your dad and you combine them, you are opening the possibilities and the likelihoods of different expressions of those combinations, right? And genetics, the study of genetics, has kind of been on what do you inherit from your parents? How does your genetic makeup transfer over to your health and your health outcomes? And what are some of the things that influence what genes get expressed and those that don't? So in the very classic sense of the word genetics, think about your mom up top, your dad down bottom. Your mom's red, your dad's blue. They make a baby, and it's got one red, one blue, and you turn out purple, right? You're getting a slice of each of your parents that come together to kind of form this new combination of the two. Now, when you think of the combining of the two, right? Traits from your dad, traits from your mom, what are those things that you're inheriting? It could be physical, like bone structure, hair color, height, metabolism, and all different kinds of facets of your physical appearance as well as your health. There are also some cross-generational features. I'm sure some of you have an example in your family of something that you have, your parents don't, but when you look back at old pictures of maybe grandparents, great aunts and uncles, you see it in them. So it's like, oh, it skipped a generation, but it's still here. So there are interesting intricacies within heritable traits and genes. So things to think about. Added layers of complexity that a lot of people kind of breeze by and don't really give too much attention to, because for the longest time we've really considered genes to be more physical and physical appearance related than we have with health. Now that people's health generally is kind of worsening over time, we are now starting to pay a little bit more attention to them and wondering what else is in those genes that is causing all of these negative health outcomes, right? So think about, what are we actually inheriting with those genes? So to expand on that heritability and kind of that combinational approach of genetics, you think about all the qualities that your mom has: brown hair, high cheekbones, she's 5'3", her family's got heart issues, cholesterol issues, stomach issues, whatever it may be. Your dad's got blonde hair, narrow face, 5'11", and then, knee problems and mental health disorders throughout his family, extended family. So when you look at those two, you combine them, and that opens the possibility for you to acquire some, all, in full force, a slighter version of each of them. All options remain possible, but based on your parents' appearance and health outcome is going to determine the likelihood of those things happening for you, right? So dad has blonde hair, mom has brown hair. You may have like strawberry blonde hair, or you may have a light brown hair. Maybe you look more like your dad or more like your mom, but you act more like your, the opposite parent. Your height may be in the middle. You may be tall like your dad. Plenty of different variations within each of those, kind of extremes of your mom and your dad. And that includes the health risks as well. I'm sure people have told you, or that you've heard, that something runs in your family, right? My great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my dad, they all had cancer, and now that puts me at a higher likelihood of that happening. So epigenetics is a good way of kind of exploring how and why that may be happening. So it begs the question, when you look at the heritability of genes and our current understanding of genes as this blueprint of who we are to become and have and look like, right? Are our genes set in stone? Is it, if you have gene X, you are going to have condition X? If your mom and your dad both have genes for blonde hair, does that mean you're guaranteed to have blonde hair? And is there any way that could change? And I mean, I'm not gonna stand here and confess to know 100% one way or the other, but based on everything that we are learning, one has to consider a certain degree of flexibility or plasticity in maybe not the structure of the genes themselves, but maybe how those genes are being read, right? So if you're looking at this this picture of a hieroglyph here, right? What story does it tell? Well, am I reading up and down? Am I reading right to left, left to right, down to up? Yes, each of these inscriptions implies a possible outcome, right? There's a direction, there's a story with it. how is it being read? How is it being connected with the other genes that are also inscribed? Are some being skipped? Is the fact that they're there automatically mean that they're a part of the story? Or is it, lots of different variables and conditions that we still aren't sure about in terms of how genes are attached to everything in our life? So if there is that flexibility and that plasticity in genetic outcomes, when we are reproducing and having children, what is their state of being from a genetic standpoint? Yes, they have the blueprint of who they are going to be, but what are the factors that actually write their story, right? The idea that, yeah, your mom may have cancer and your dad may not like blueberries. You could you could grow up loving blueberries and not getting cancer, right? So it's like, do you really start kind of with a clean slate, that tabula rasa, or are you bound to your genetic history? And this is where epigenetics comes into play. So epigenetics are things outside of the genes themselves, independent of the structure of the gene, right? So it's not like cutting and clipping and sewing back together parts of the genes. These are things that are, without actually changing the structure of the gene itself, changing the outputs of the genes, right? How those hieroglyphs are being read. And you'll see here in these graphs, I have listed vitamins, minerals, and nutrients. My focus in the epigenetic realm has been from a food and nutrition standpoint, and how those kinds of things are influencing our gene outputs. But it is not just food and nutrition. Environmental stresses, nuclear fallout, that's an extreme example, but radiation, sun exposure, it could be heavy metal contamination, all different kinds, just like life stress and, wartime and famine, what have you, all, throughout our lineage. All of these things have an influence on how our genes start to express. Think about graying hair. When you get stressed and your hair turns gray, is that because you have genes for gray hair? Or is it because the genes for brown hair that you have altered in a way that they're not brown anymore? Food for thought. So here's a good definition of epigenetic inheritance. So the transmission of epigenetic markers and modifications from one generation to multiple subsequent generations without altering the primary structure of the DNA itself. Okay, so altering how things are manifesting and looking and, your health outcomes, but not actually rewriting any of the blueprint coded in your DNA, right? And we'll talk more about what those factors are that play into changing those outcomes. Things like life experiences, traumas, even personal preferences, right? I know in my family, I have a history of artistry. People that are artistically inclined, writers, painters. I've got woodworkers as well, a lot of carpenters in my family. And this goes hundreds of years. So just strange things like that we don't really have a scientific understanding of just yet. So a key point and a good base foundation to move off of from here is the idea that your genes, the hard set in stone blueprint of your being, they are inseparable from the outside environment that the genes are living in. as well as the environment within the cell itself that the DNA is encased in, the environment that the DNA is producing, right? So there's this constant feedback of, okay, what are the instructions in the DNA? Okay, what are the raw materials that DNA is kind of using to create its environment? Within that environment, how is that environment interacting with the outside environment to influence how the genes continue to express, right? So there's this constant feedback loop back and forth between the two. And from an evolutionary standpoint, it makes complete sense, right? We are always interacting with our environment. The more you interact with your environment, the more influence your environment will have on your adaptability, right? So I love a good nature metaphor, and trees trees are the easiest for me to work off of. So the seed of the tree is basically like the genes. It's the instruction manual inherited from the mother tree on how to become a tree, right? And based on looking at that mother tree, looking at the bark, the leaves, the seasonality, and how it, how tall it gets, how big, how thick the trunk, whatever, all of those different characteristics of a tree. That's all the possibility and the capability are all held within that seed. And when that seed is in that initial soil with its water, it kind of, all of the genes within that seed are starting to materialize into something physical, right? It's kind of blooming into a sprout of sorts. But once that sprout exits the soil and starts to interact with the outside environment, it is now simultaneously following the instructions within the seed, but in conjunction with the external cues from its environment, right? We have this, if you took two seeds from the same mother plant, put one in soil in the shade with no water, you put another one in the sun with water, they're going to develop very differently. They will have different characteristics. I mean, you're going to be able to tell in a way that they came from the same tree, but they will lead very different lives and possess very different characteristics based on the resources available to them. And epigenetics is asking, okay, what is the sun? What is the water? What is the soil quality and those resources that are influencing the expression and the growth of that tree, but in a human form? So another great metaphor, in case that tree one didn't hit, I love the idea of genes as keys on a piano, right? Just, you've got hundreds of thousands of genes spread out across this huge, big piano. Now, there are genes are like possibilities, right? They're laying the groundwork for what could happen in case of this environment, in case of this environment. Like, it's kind of covering all your edges just to make sure that you're safe. Now, it's not like, oh, if you have all of these genes, that means all of them are going to express all at the same time. That would be equivalent of having 1 million fingers pressing down on a keyboard all at the same time. Is that going to make music? No, it's going to make a noise, but it's not going to be harmonious at all, right? So the gears are, or the keys rather, are gears and switches, the machinery for which our body is able to put together a song. Now, the environment, the fingers, are the things that are going to press certain keys at certain moments to build this kind of like orchestrated symphony of our health, of our physical appearance, of our life, what have you, okay? Now, the study of epigenetics is figuring out what those fingers are, right? What are the conditions? What are the tools and resources that are playing these piano keys? And how does one use those tools and resources, those fingers, to play their genetic song through the piano keys? Okay. Should have been a poet. So you have to ask yourself, if you're thinking about having kids, trying to have kids, or aspire to have kids, or have just recently had kids, think about what's in a new human starter pack, right? They're getting the blueprint, right? Those are the DNA blocks, right? The A's, C's, T's, and G's that form the double helical ladder that make up the blueprint, right? Those are like the instructions on how to be a human structurally. It's the machinery, right? All the instructions on how to make that happen. Within that blueprint are things kind of like hair color, bone structure, organ function, your heartbeat, your nervous system and how it connects to every part of your body, and the very like fundamental baseline functions of humanness. But also, for a newly formed human, there are also like as part of your gestation during pregnancy, you're growing cells, you're growing organs and organ systems through what your mother is eating to create an environment where the instructions and the blueprints within the seed are able to effectively build what it is are in the instructions or in the blueprint, right? And epigenetics, again, I'm gonna beat this dead horse all the way home. We have to find out what those factors are when we touched on food and nutrition in terms of building a child during pregnancy. But nutrient availability, carcinogens, like, do you have all the good stuff? Good. Are you getting rid and controlling and managing the bad stuff? Environmental stress and the downstream effects of all of those. How are we managing those to influence health outcomes? So this is kind of a macro presentation on that idea, but let's just say you have liver dysfunction that runs in your family. So your dad has liver dysfunction, but he gets by, does what he does, whatever, he lives long enough to have you have liver dysfunction as well. So now you've got a faulty liver that is unable to do its job in its entirety, and that affects other systems in your body that causes more complications, right? And alters your status even more. Now, if you live long enough to procreate, the child that you have is now going to inherit not just the liver dysfunction, but also the altered downstream environment caused by that initial liver dysfunction. So now it's not just liver dysfunction, it's everything downstream from that. So now, generation across generation, all of these deficits and imbalances are compounding if we are not able to address the environmental stresses causing these negative health outcomes, these negative genetic outcomes. Okay, so where are we missing? What are we missing with implementing this in our current state of health? Because we have some good information, right? Genetic therapy, genetics are a part of the mainstream curriculum, not just in the general population, but also in medicine as well. We have come to accept and we actively consider the heritability of genes and their bodily manifestations, right? You know, if someone with Down syndrome wants to have a child, we understand the likelihood of that child having Down syndrome because of the genetic heritability. The same could go for any condition, right? I have type 1 diabetes. If I were to have a child right now, the likelihood of that child getting type 1 diabetes is greater than if I did not. So we have that, okay? Genes, things we have come to accept as being tied to genes are passed on to those who inherit our genes. Number 2 is that we have also come to acknowledge and accept that environmental conditions and cellular environments have the ability to affect the expression of said genes. Okay, so genes have a potency to them in order to cause an outcome in the body, whether it be a physical characteristic, a health outcome, what have you. And we know that within a lifetime, minus any, reproducing or offspring or anything like that, a person can be put through an experience in a lifetime in a way that affects their body enough to change the expression of genes. This could be developing cancer. It could be, having gray hair after a certain amount of life stress. I have type 1 diabetes. No one in my family lineage that has ever been recorded has ever had type 1 diabetes. So we don't really, we know that genes are inherited. They have ties to disease. We know that the environment can influence genes to express disease. We have not combined those two concepts together to acknowledge the heritability of not just the genes themselves, but also the cellular environment that is influencing the outcome of the genes. So this can be kind of heavy, so hang in there with a second. We'll take it nice and slow. All right. So yes, we inherit genes, right? That kind of goes without saying. You look like your mom and dad in some way, some trait. You can see kind of how that works out. Does the cellular environment affect the genes? Yes. Is that able to be influenced within a lifetime? Yes. Okay, so the environment can influence your genetic expression. Now, when someone reproduces and creates offspring, we know the genes are transferred, but I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone who comes right out and say, yes, they do also inherit the cellular environment. So we're acknowledging that genes are inherited. We're acknowledging that the cellular environment affects the expression of genes, but we haven't tied that heritability feature to the cellular environment as well. And we'll go more into detail here. So this is kind of like our current understanding, right? So in this epigenetic example, on the left-hand side, we've got mom at the top, dad at the bottom. Each one of your parents has a different degree, a different ratio of available nutrients, right? And each of these are affecting the genetic expression of the genes they have. Mom's double red, dad's double blue. Now, when they create you, we know and acknowledge that you are getting a blue strand from dad and a red strand from mom, each of those carrying a possible likelihood of the conditions that were expressed in their own life. But we do not acknowledge the vitamins, minerals, nutrients, all of those external components that either increased or decreased the likelihood of the genes in their respective bodies, right? So yes, we know that you're getting a blue from your dad and a red from your mom, but we completely bypass and ignore, okay, well, what vitamins, minerals, and nutrients are you also getting? Because yes, the red strand and the blue strand are, have certain characteristics tied to them. But what's more important is what vitamins, minerals, and nutrients do they have to help gauge and impact what those genes are going to do, right? So what it actually looks like is, okay, your mom's slightly imbalanced one way, your dad's slightly imbalanced the other. When you inherit their genes, you get each of their genes, right? You get a blue and a red. But you also kind of it doesn't have to be, it's not like, oh, you're taking the mean of both, where it's just like, oh, you get the average level. If your mom has high sodium and your dad has low sodium, you're going to have medium sodium. But the general idea is that you are not instantly inheriting just a full toolbox of all of the nutrients needed for those genes to do exactly what they need to do. And this conceptually makes so much sense to me, and I don't know why people aren't talking about it, because we have a whole new generation of kids that are more sick than ever before, and we are doing nothing to address the cellular environment affecting the genes. We are so caught up in genetic therapy and kind of like bringing out the scissors and cutting stuff and sewing it back together, when in reality, we're not paying attention at all to the cellular health from a nutrient standpoint on all of the factors that go into these genes doing, expressing themselves. So get my head out of the way here. But we need a way of mapping the link between the genes that we have and the cellular environment that affects the final product. So we'll just kind of go with this. So you're inheriting your parents' genes. You're also inheriting the cellular environment that your parents created and cultivated through their diet, through their life experiences, what have you. So your mom and your dad both have gene XYZ, which codes for diabetes. They didn't have diabetes because in their bodily state, gene XYZ only turns on at a certain sodium-potassium imbalance. And this is completely made up. This is not true at all, but just think of it from an ideological standpoint. So you have inherited this gene that makes it possible for you to become diabetic. Your parents didn't know that they had that gene because they never became diabetic, because the cellular environment in their body never reached a point where that gene got activated. However, when they had you inherited that gene, so now you have the gene to also have diabetes, but you also inherited their imbalanced system. So now when you combine the product of their imbalanced system, you also come into this world with that gene and with an imbalanced system that is closer to activating the disease gene. Now, through whatever life conditions, stress, poor diet, whatever. Finally, you cross the threshold and that gene is activated, you now have that disease. So the gene is only half the story. What tools and resources are you also inheriting from a cellular standpoint, a nutritional standpoint, a life circumstance standpoint that is influencing the activation of those genes? So this may seem overwhelming because, it's like, it's a little bit freeing because you're like, okay, I'm not just the loser of the genetic lottery, and just because I have the gene for it doesn't mean it needs to be expressed. That's incredible. But what are the things that you can do as part of the general population that you can do to positively impact the cellular environment in a way to heal or decrease the likelihood of disease development? So you have to think to yourself, is there something measurable? It's better if it's quantifiable, because that way you can track it, you can look for it in your environment, whether it be food, setting, whatever. What are the things that influence your genes? And we talked about it before. Environmental toxins, right? It's like bleach, cleaners, microplastics, carcinogens. Did your parents smoke? Did your mom drink alcohol while you were being made? Pro-inflammatory substances in their food. It could be, oils, sugar, iron, any combination of these things. We know that on a conceptual level, we understand what is not good for us. And yet we can't really put our finger on exactly how it is impacting the cells, right? The worst diagnosis you could get at this point in your life is, oh, well, it's because of inflammation. Well, it's like, we know inflammation is bad, but if we don't know why it's happening, it is impossible to stop. But what do all of those things that we just mentioned, the environmental toxins, carcinogens, and those pro-inflammatory substances, what is the lowest common denominator that they are impacting that could have an effect on the health of the cell and the health of the genes? Vitamins and minerals. These are the fundamental foundational currency of your cellular health. Cell Biology 101, sodium potassium channels, calcium gated neurotransmitter release, and, the phospholipid bilayer. That's what I was trying to think of. Phospholipid bilayer and, fatty acids, proteins, and enzymes within the cell, right? What are all of those things made up of? You think of all like mitochondria and, cell wall and cell, all of those things. What are they made up of? What's a currency that makes them do what they need to do? Vitamins and minerals. So, as someone interested in influencing the cellular environment to positively impact their genetic outputs, what can you do? We know that cellular environments change in real time, right? Go through a period of stress and see how you feel afterwards. See the physical changes in you. So you have to know where you're starting from. What have you inherited from a genetic standpoint, but also from like a health standpoint in terms of mineral balance, right? I know my mom, me personally, my mom is extremely low in magnesium. I know both of my parents have compromised liver function. That's kind of like, that was the hand I was dealt. And now what can I do to positively impact that? So as a child, if you have children or you're, remembering back to your childhood, you're operating with the genes you inherited from your parents, but also within their inherited nutritional states. From those imbalances and deficiencies that most of us are dealing with, I'm the child of baby boomers. You may be, products of Gen Xers or even earlier, but, none of the things that we are fed throughout our childhood acknowledge the significance of balance in health from a nutrient and a vitamin standpoint, right? This can go, baby formulas. This could be fried food, added sugar, processed foods, and all of these additives. We have no concept of the state of imbalance that it is causing in our cells And we have not made that connection between the state of cellular imbalance and that effect on our genetic output. And that doesn't even acknowledge the physiological impacts of things like emotional and traumatic things. They all, anything emotional, traumatic is going to impact your electrolytes in your body. Whether it's high cortisol, higher oxidative stress, a loss of, potassium, sodium, magnesium, all of these things are going to affect how your cells work and how those genes are expressing. So I stand by this 10,000%. Mineral balance is where genetics and epigenetics collide. You are not only inheriting the genes from your parents, you're also inheriting their stresses and their nutrition. From that, and beginning your own life experiences, cultivating more deficiency, more imbalance through your psychological stress and through your own nutritional choices. So it's just compounding more and more and more. So let's talk quickly through this family tree, right? So you've got your maternal grandparents and your paternal grandparents. They each, and these values are completely arbitrary. These aren't actual values by any means. We're just kind of for visualization's sake. So magnesium, calcium, sodium, potassium, you see what these levels are. Magnesium, everyone's over 30. Calcium, everyone's over 85. So on and so forth. So now, let's look at that second generation now, right? So now you have your mom and your dad. Now, how have things changed? Magnesium, a little bit lower. Calcium, just a little bit lower. Sodium, potassium, just everything is kind of ever so slightly changing. Things to consider, right? What are your grandparents eating when they made your parents? What did your parents eat as they were being raised and developing as a human? What were they eating when they made you? What did you eat as you were developing with your parents, right? All of these crazy economical distress, you could fall on hard times, there could be famine, there could be war. All of these things are depleting our bodies of important resources. So now it comes to your siblings. You and your siblings from your parents. You look at these values. Okay, magnesium's definitely lower than it was. Calcium, it's okay. Things are changing, right? These are things that no one is really paying attention to. Sodium, potassium have totally changed. Now, when you superimpose that over your grandparents and your parents, we're looking at ratios, right? The idea of balance. You need some of one and some of the other. What the ratio is, again, these ratios are not actually accurate to the way it is in the body, but to visualize how it changes from generation to generation is what I would argue is how that we have arrived at our state of chronic inflammation. We have just blown up these natural ratios of nutrients and minerals in our body to a point that our genes have no choice but to express this kind of state of emergency. And so I've talked about this in an episode before, but the genes tied to diabetes, right? I think more than 10 that, if you have these genes, the likelihood of you having diabetes goes up. But having those genes does not mean that you're going to get diabetes. And in fact, of all of the people that have the quote unquote diabetic genes, 5% are the ones that develop it. Only 5%. So 95% of the people that have diabetes genes don't get diabetes. The genetic component of that is so weak. There needs to be another external environmental factor that is influencing why those genes are being expressed in so many more people today than ever before. And so this kind of sheds a light on, okay, well, how are kids, I have raised the point before that nutrition is imperative, is so crucial in the development of diabetes, right? Because that's the source of, that's what's enriching the soil from which our seed grows. And people say, well, I was diagnosed when I was 2 years old. How could I possibly have eaten my way into diabetes if I'm 2 years old? I'm still being weaned off of my mother. Well, what was the state of your mother when she had you? What was your deck of cards, so to speak, in terms of nutrients available and your genetic makeup to make it so that you only needed like 2 years to push you over the edge into this state of disease, right? And again, it explains kind of the lack of heritability from a diabetic standpoint. We have tons of first generation type 1 diabetics who have no ties in their family, right? That being said, conditions, outside, external environmental conditions have remained consistent. Poor nutrition, poor diet, poor mental health, poor emotional health, all of these things that go into actually influencing the genes themselves. Holy moly. All right. So a lot of really deep information. Re-listen to this if you need to, pause and go back, what have you. I wrote a book documenting everything that I have found, tying the importance of minerals, tying the importance of balance and the heritability of all of the things that influence the development of disease in my book called An Ironclad Cause. I'll have it linked in the description along with some of other resources that I offer, supplement guides, nutrition guides, things that I'm taking as well. And follow me on TikTok too. A lot more short form content. You get to see a little bit more of me than you do on the podcast, but subscribe. We are in this together. Okay. It has to be us. It has to be. No one is more invested in this than us. Our biggest limiting factor is our belief in our ability to do so. And I think understanding the epigenetic makeup of how this disease develops opens so many opportunities, opens so many doors for people who did not know that they were there. We need to keep learning, keep sharing, and keep experimenting in order to build a beautiful, beautiful product, which is a better state of health. All right. So this is episode 21, Diabetics for Diabetics Radio. My name is Bowie Madison. Thank you so much for being here. Enjoy the rest of your day.